It's our weekly Spotlight on Podcast segment. The podcast is called Words and Numbers, and I'm joined by Anthony Davies. He's a Milton Friedman Distinguished Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, and James Harrigan. He is a senior editor at the American Institute for Economic Research. Gentlemen, welcome. Nice to have you.
Good morning.
Great to be here.
And just a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like to call in or leave or make a comment or ask a question, feel free to do that. You can start calling in now. The lines are by party affiliation: Republicans 202-748-8001, Democrats 202-748-8000, and Independents 202-748-8002. Well, Anthony, let me start with you. Tell us about the podcast, Words and Numbers. What does it focus on?
Words and Numbers is a look at current events through the eyes of an economist and a political scientist. We take a nonpartisan view of the world. That's not to say we don't have strong opinions about things, but we will call to task Democrats and Republicans equally when we think they've gone wrong.
And tell me about the format. Who do you talk to? How often do you do the podcast?
The episodes come out weekly on Wednesdays. They're about half hour, give or take, depending on what's going on. I'd say 2/3 of the episodes are just James and I talking about something. 1/3 of the episodes will have guests on. We've had guests such as Senator Phil Gramm, Senator Lincoln Chafee, Vernon Smith, a Nobel laureate in economics, talking about their areas of expertise. But generally speaking, we take as our topic whatever it is of interest to the day to non-expert, intelligent people.
Well, James, I wanted to ask about the target audience. When you say non-experts, tell me about who you're trying to reach and what do you want people to know?
We're trying to reach everyone. And that's kind of hard when you're talking about an online process that you rarely come in contact with anybody in the real world. It turns out I think we've got the best format we're ever going to get. We have a big section right before the main, 2 ridiculous news stories, and a 3rd that's specifically newsworthy and stupid. And we run with those.
Well, Anthony, your most recent podcast episode was called How Did We Get Here? And it touched on a lot of the recent economic issues of the day. And one of them, obviously, is government spending, and where Congress is expected to finish the omnibus bill that's $1.7 trillion. First, let's talk about your reaction to that top-line number.
Well, it's not surprising. Actually, if there's anything surprising here, that it's not higher than it is. We've reached the point in our country, and we've come here in little steps over the past 100 years, to the point at which voters just want free stuff. And, I'll take whatever it is the government can give me so long as somebody else is paying for it. And if all of us have that attitude, we end up where we are, which is a burgeoning federal debt. And you get to the point that the federal government has borrowed so much money that it runs out of places to borrow more. And so what do? Well, we print the money, and that gives us inflation. And so, when we go to the gas pump anymore and we complain about the price of gas, what we're really paying for in that high price of gas are all those stimulus checks that came out back in the age of COVID, plus all the deficits we've been running for the past half century.
Well, I want to ask you about the current debt ceiling limit, because we are expected to reach that sometime next year. What are the issues? Why do we have a debt ceiling, and what are the issues with raising that?
Yeah, I like to refer to it, it's not so much a ceiling as it is a low-hanging mist. That is, the Congress can raise the debt ceiling anytime it likes, and on average, it has raised it about every 6 months over the past 4 or 5 decades. So what it ends up being is not so much a ceiling on the debt as an opportunity for the politicians to get in front of the media and to say things like, I'm fighting for you, whether you are interested in holding the debt constant or whether you are interested in blowing through it and having more spending. It's an opportunity for the politicians to get in front of the media rather than it being any real economic stricture on the federal government.
And James, what are you expecting with Republican control of the House? Do you think certain spending will go down? Will the top line go down? Will it go up? What are you expecting?
You should always expect more of the same. The Democrats and the Republicans, I think, link with each other. They're both on the same team at this point. They have progressives have slightly different talking points, but when you get down to it, there's no way to say that our government will function through this. If you really want to talk about parties, I think it's going to be an ugly conversation.
All right, let's go to a question on Twitter from Dion in New Jersey. He's asking, what has the Trump tax cut done for the U.S. economy? Anthony?
Yeah, I would say that the short answer is not much. And the reason it's not much is any given president's policies only hit the economy around the edges. The economy has an inertia to it that has been built up over the course of decades of many presidents, many Congresses on both sides of the aisle. And to move that is like trying to move a battleship that's plowing through the water. There's not much a single person can do.
And I'll just remind our viewers that you can call in and ask a question or make a comment. The lines are Republicans, 202-748-8001, Democrats, 202-748-8000, and Independents, 202-748-8002. Let's take a question from Jim, who's calling from Winter Park, Florida, Republican line. Hi, Jim.
Hi, good morning. I would just love to know their feelings about this cryptocurrency, the FTX debacle that's going on right now. I'm not a cryptocurrency person, but, the thing that gets me is this is stolen money. This is money that was stolen from people that invested in FTX. Mm-hmm. And the senators and congressmen and stuff are going, oh, well, I'm just going to donate this money that I got from Sam Bankman-Fried to this charity or that charity. If you steal a bank, they get the money back and they give it back to the bank. It should be going back to investors of FTX. And I'd like to know their opinion on this. Thanks.
On the FTX business, I'm right in the same room with you. These people committed terrible crimes, and they're going to have to be accountable at some point. Now, whether they can make all of their clients whole, I really doubt it. Broadly speaking on crypto, I'm pretty sure it has a place. I'm pretty sure it's not going away anytime soon. But when you crawl into the details and take a good look at how it works, you walk away knowing that there's going to be risk, and it might be significant. All right, I wish I had bought Bitcoin before, but I didn't.
All right.
So it goes.
Anthony, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I would say it's important to keep two things separate. One is financial fraud and the other is cryptocurrency. And the problem with FTX is financial fraud. They happen to use cryptocurrency in going about it. So I'm concerned that cryptocurrency gets tainted by this. Cryptocurrency at the moment is just a toy. But I think long term it's going to serve a purpose. We just haven't figured out how to use it correctly. I would not at all be surprised that 30, 40 years from now, it becomes the de facto global currency.
And Anthony, on the podcast, you had said something interesting. You said that we'll eventually get to the point where we can't pay back what we've borrowed or the interest. Explain that.
Well, we're already there in a sense. The official federal debt is $30 trillion plus. But then you can add on to that what's called unfunded liabilities. This is money the federal government has promised to current and future retirees, largely in the form of Social Security benefits. And it's unclear how much the unfunded liabilities are, but the estimates range from $100 to $300 trillion. So even if you take the low end of that, we're in a space where if the federal government devoted 100% of its tax revenues toward paying what it owes on the debt and what it owes on the unfunded liabilities, we wouldn't be able to pay it off. So the long and short of it is, what that means is we're going to reach a place where we run into the laws of mathematics, that we simply can't continue doing the things we've been doing. What that looks like, I don't know, but the Congressional Budget Office itself is estimating that we're going to have to cut Social Security benefits by 20% or increase Social Security taxes by 20% or a combination of the two at some point within the next 10 years.
All right, let's talk to Daniel next. He's in Winter Springs, Florida, Republican line. Good morning, Daniel.
Yes, good morning. I have a question for both of your hosts, about your Mr. Davies especially. The United States is now turning into a country that is anti-oil and anti-gas. We have enough money in the ground to pay off our national debt if we would produce our oil and gas. But we have decided to follow a hoax that is perpetrated, I believe, by Russia, Iran, and Saudi Arabia, and OPEC. And they are extracting the wealth out of our country while the American people continue to borrow against and produce nothing.
All right.
If we don't start producing.
All right, Daniel, let's get a response. Go ahead, Anthony.
Well, I would say a couple things here. First is that when we purchase oil or anything else from a foreign country, we have a tendency to look at that as this is somehow costing us because there are dollars going out of the country to pay for this stuff that we could otherwise produce ourselves. And we're missing half of the picture. The other half of the picture is, what do the foreigners do with those dollars? They buy things that we produce. Now, we might not be producing oil, we're buying it instead from foreign countries, but instead we're producing semiconductors, we're producing machine parts, which we're in turn selling to the foreign countries. So it's not a matter of us somehow losing out because we're purchasing foreign oil, rather it's a shifting of our productive capacity away from one thing towards something else.
And Daniel said that we've got enough in the ground to pay off the debt. Is that true?
I don't know the numbers off the top of my head, but one of the things you have to be careful of here is doing the following. Taking how much oil we estimate's in the ground, multiply by the price of oil, that equals $30 trillion. And we're missing several things. One is it costs something to get the oil out of the ground. Two, if we were to pull all of that oil out of the ground and dump it on the market, the price of oil would drop precipitously. And all of a sudden you don't have $30 trillion, you have something less. The key here is not about pulling the oil out of the ground. The key is restraining the federal government, because that's the source of our problem here. The politicians over decades have been simply spending more money than we have.
All right, let's go to Buffalo, New York next. On the Democrats line, Tom, good morning.
Morning. My question is the tax breaks for the rich. How did it help the rich? I'll take the answer off the phone.
All right, which one of you would like to take that?
I'll take it.
Well,
Go ahead, James. Go ahead, James.
It might well be the case that progressives, people at the top of the food chain politically, it's perfectly possible for them to suffer, but nonetheless having the system work. Right? It doesn't guarantee an outcome. It guarantees fair and just population.
Yeah, I think one of the things we have to keep in mind here is we've constructed a tax code that is highly progressive at the federal level, and we've done it for good reason. We want the rich to be paying more, and we want to be able to help the poor. But when you have a highly progressive tax code like that, virtually any tax cut is a tax cut for the rich, because that's principally the only people who are paying.
All right, and we have a question for you, Anthony, from Phil in Mackinac City, Michigan. He says this: with all the money that's getting spent, we're seeing the inflation being reflected in a rising stock market. Do Keynes's ideas of spending apply?
This is really interesting, because what's happened over the decades is that politicians have pointed to John Maynard Keynes, who said, when we're in recession, we need to spend more. And so when we go into recession, they say, look, here's an economist. He says we should spend more. What politicians don't do, and this applies to politicians on both sides of the aisle, what they don't do is quote Keynes' next sentence. His next sentence is, when the economy is expanding, you need to cut back on government spending. Somehow they don't like to quote that part. And so what's happened is we've got to this place where we've just been ratcheting up government spending. Every time we go into recession, we're going to spend more. We go into expansion, we don't cut back. We get this burgeoning federal budget that we have now. And you end up in this space where we've got to print money. And this is what we did during COVID. We printed the money to pay for the $6 trillion sum spending. And much of that money went into financial markets, driving up stock prices. And we saw the rising stock market. We said, this is great. Look, stock prices are going up. And we didn't see inflation. We said, look at what's happening. We can print money and we don't get inflation. Yeah, but what happened is when things settled down after COVID, people took that money out of financial markets. They moved it into goods and services markets. And that's when we saw the inflation. That's what we're experiencing now. It comes down the road 6, 12, 18 months after the fact, but we're feeling now the echo in inflation of that money printing that occurred back during COVID.
And it looks like we lost our link to James, but we're very happy to still have you, Anthony. We have a question from Mark in California who asks you via text, what do you think of a gold standard versus this fiat currency we have now?
I'm in favor of a gold standard, and here's why. Let me tell you why it's not. There's nothing magical about gold. People say, well, gold has inherent value, you should have a gold standard. That's not it. What makes a gold standard valuable is that there's only so much gold out there. And if there's only so much gold out there and your paper dollars are tied to the gold, then you can only have so many paper dollars. It's restricting the number of dollars that's important. Whether you do that via tying to a gold standard or tying to a land standard or fresh water or just simply writing it into law, there shall not be more than so many dollars in circulation. That's what you need, is to control the number of dollars in circulation if you want to prevent what we have now, which is the government in effect printing money to pay for what it wants.
All right, let's talk to Zach next on the independent line, Veradale, Washington. Good morning, Zach.
I mainly had a question about the future of income for the average American citizen. There's been a lot of concern amongst the younger generation about, changing job patterns and having to have 2 or 3 different jobs in your lifetime because your older jobs become obsolete. What are your thoughts on universal basic income and the potential?
Well, we've got a bad connection to you, Zach.
Yeah. But let me talk a little bit about universal basic income, because it's one of these things that I'm for, but with a very large footnote. And the large footnote is this: I think we would be much better off in this country with a universal basic income that replaced everything we do to help the poor. So have universal basic income, but get rid of everything from housing subsidies to minimum wage to unemployment insurance, all of it. Get rid of all of it, replace it with universal basic income. That's a better solution than what we have now for all sorts of reasons. But I'm very hesitant there because politicians are unlikely to do that. What they're likely to do is to put universal basic income on top of everything we're currently doing. And that's going to be way worse than what we have now.
All right, Scott is next. Chesterfield, Missouri, Republican. Good morning.
Happy holidays, folks. I appreciate the program this morning. Why does our federal government not work within a balanced budget? Households do it, states do it. Why can they not do it? I'll listen to the response online. Thanks.
Yeah, the simple reason is because nobody actually wants that. Now, we can all say we want a balanced budget, but the fact is, when it comes down to it, if the government offers me something I want for quote unquote free, I'm going to say yeah, so long as somebody else pays for it. But every one of the 300 million of us are saying that, and what you get is this situation in which we're all electing to office politicians who promise to give us stuff, making somebody else pay for it. And before you know it, that's the entirety of Congress. They're looking to simply spend more and more money, and they'll make noise about restricting their spending, but it doesn't happen. We can trace all of this back to the 1920s, when we as a society decided that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution no longer applied. That's the section of the Constitution that laid out what the federal government was allowed to do. And if you read that, there are about 8 or 9 things there. That's it. We said we want the federal government to do more. For all sorts of very good reasons we said that. But what comes from that is what we have now, a federal government that in effect has no limits.
Anthony, here's a question on via text. It says, to what degree is the labor shortage contributing to inflation?
The labor shortage isn't contributing to inflation. Inflation, generally speaking, occurs when your money supply grows faster than your production of goods and services. You have more and more dollars chasing the same number of goods and services. What's happening with labor is kind of interesting. On the one hand, a bunch of people dropped out of the labor force because of COVID. They discovered that they liked not working, and maybe they were close to retirement anyway. They decided not to go back, or maybe it was a two-income household and they discovered that they actually can do with one income. So some of it's that. But then there's this other interesting thing that we're just trying to get our heads around now, and that's the gig economy. 1/3 of workers say that they have gig income on the side, maybe from Uber or Airbnb or doing some crafts that they sell on Etsy or whatever it is. 1/3 of workers have income on the side through the gig economy, and 1/3 of those say that it's their major source of income. So we've got a tremendous number of workers in the gig economy, and here's now the problem. We haven't figured out how to count them yet. They aren't employees, so they don't show up in business employee numbers, and they aren't small businesses, or at least most of them probably haven't registered as small businesses, so they aren't showing up on IRS Schedule Cs. In effect, there's no paperwork here such that we can count them as being employed.
All right, Dave is next. Lynchburg, Virginia, Independent Line.
Good morning.
Good morning, Dave. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. Thanks for taking my call. Thanks for C-SPAN. Merry Christmas. I want to know if there are any current politicians in office that has a viable plan to cut back spending and do something about the debt. It seems like every politician gets up there and their solution to everything is to throw more money at it. Are there any programs that have been going for the last 20 years that could be looked at to discontinue? That's my question.
Yeah, and I think the short answer to that is no. There might be one or two, but the short answer is no, and here's why. If you give me two politicians who are identical in every way except one, this guy's primary goal is to seek the common good, to do what's right, what's best for society. This guy's primary goal is to win elections. On average, this guy's going to win. The politician who's going to win is the politician whose primary goal it is to win elections. And how do we win elections? I've got to appeal to the voters, and usually I've got to do it in a 10-second soundbite. What can I do in a 10-second soundbite? I can say, elect me and I'll give you free tuition. What can I not do in a 10-second soundbite is explain to you why that's a very bad idea.
All right, let's talk to Ava next. She's in Columbia, Mississippi, Republican. Hi, Ava.
Hi, how are you today? I want to know, on the news recently, AOC or whatever her initials are, they were talking about her having gotten free tickets. Does she have to count that as income? And does Joe Biden have to count when he stays in these $21 million mansions? How does he count that? If the taxpayers are having to pay for it, why don't he just go to his own home for the holidays?
There are rules about this. I don't know the particulars of the rules, but I know they do exist about politicians, elected officials receiving things. And it's all sorts of minuscule rules here about if it's over a certain amount, then you have to count it. If it's a meal where you're sitting down, you have to count it. If you're standing up, believe it or not, you don't. There's all kinds of things in place here. So the short answer is, yes, they do count it. The things that they don't count will tend to be small items that we wouldn't care about anyway.
All right, and here's a, a comment from Kieran in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It's not complicated. Government needs to be transparent and spend money within means. It's no different than what responsible people do, to spend money wisely and efficiently. And
yeah.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. You can make a comment on that.
I think that's absolutely right. And what hurts me to the core is that you can find people on the left and people on the right who agree with that. And we will tend not to see that we agree with each other because politicians, both Democrats and Republicans, have an incentive to keep us fighting each other. So long as they can keep us fighting each other, convince the people on the left that the people on the right are evil, convince the people on the right that the people on the left are stupid, or whatever it is, so long as they can keep us at each other's throats, we keep fighting each other, and we never come to that conclusion that your listener is coming to, which is actually this is a very smart thing, and we all agree on it. Now, we might disagree on particular details around the edges. But in general, we agree with the general direction the country should take. But we never get to that point because we're too busy fighting. And the politicians like that.
And here's Ben in Wilmington, North Carolina. He says, Anthony mentioned that we no longer abide by the Constitution. How does the government justify their expansion since it's outside the enumerated powers? What laws do they reference?
Oh, there are all sorts of gymnastics that the Supreme Court has done over the years. And if you study constitutional law, Constitutional Law 101 starts to go through these things. All sorts of things. The key, the poster child of this is a decision that was back in the 1940s or 50s, where a man is growing corn to feed his cows, and the government comes in and tells him that he can only grow so much corn. And the argument is the Constitution allows the federal government to say that. Why? Because, and this is actually what the Supreme Court said, by growing this corn and feeding your cows, you aren't buying corn on the market. And if you aren't buying corn on the market, some of that corn that you're not buying, it may have come from across state lines. That's interstate commerce. By the Interstate Commerce Clause, we, the federal government, are now authorized to regulate you feeding your cows. It's gymnastics like that that the Supreme Court has done over many decades that has led us to where we are.
All right, and I'm just reminding people that we're going to be continuing to take your calls for about 15 minutes until the end of the program. Republicans, 202-748-8001. Democrats, 202-748-8000. And Independents, 202-748-8002. Anthony, a tweet from James who says this: perfect financial formula. The tax rates on the wealthy from 1940 to 1980 were double to triple today's rates. Reagan slashed these rates, and that's why we have so much debt. What do you think?
Yeah, one of the things we get wrong about tax rates is how much people are actually paying. We like to say this thing about the rich should pay their fair share. Of course, oddly, nobody says what fair is, so it's unclear whether they are or are not paying their fair share. But if we look at what they're actually paying, and the numbers I'm about to quote to you come from the Congressional Budget Office, and they look at all taxes people pay to the federal government. So income taxes, payroll taxes, capital gains taxes, tariffs, the whole thing. Everything you pay to the federal government as a fraction of your entire income from all sources, wages, capital gains, inheritance, whatever it is. If we look at your total federal taxes divided by your total income, we can ask how much are you actually paying here when all the dust settles, after you've done your accounting and legal gymnastics and write-offs and deductions, what are you actually paying? And if we ask that, what we find is that the top 1% pay about 30%, 32%. Middle income Americans pay around 11%. The poor pay around 5%. But what we have ignored through that entire conversation is transfers. Transfers are the opposite of taxes. Instead of the government taking money off the table, it gives you money. And when we account for transfers, what we find is that the top 1% pay around 30, 32%. Middle-income Americans pay about -5%. That is, they get back from the federal government more than they pay in. The poor pay around -125%. So this business about the rich not paying enough, it flies in the face of the numbers. Now, we can argue that they should pay even more still, and I'm willing to entertain that argument. But I think we first have to start by asking, what are they actually paying now?
All right, let's go to Bob next. Louisville, Kentucky, Republican line. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Hey, really interesting conversation. Whether we've talked about UBI or Ukraine or elections, everything boils down to dollars. One of your guests talked about $30 trillion in debt a while ago, and I have deep concerns. I talk with people about this all the time. Nobody really understands what that means, and we really didn't have any context in the conversation this morning. I guess I'm a simplistic person. If I go and I want to say, how many dollars does each taxpayer owe? I go and Google, there's about 150 million individual income tax returns filed in this country. So if my iPhone is doing the math correctly, that's about $200,000 per person. We have young people who think on average $30,000 in student debt is bad. I'm not sure. Nobody I talk with who's in their 20s or 30s understands each one of them is carrying $200,000 in federal debt as being an individual taxpayer. We talked about running out of money, if my math is right here. I see that interest rates are heading up to 5%. Well, $200,000, 5%, that's $10,000 per year is going to be the interest on each and every American's debt. So $10,000 per year from each of the 150 million taxpayers. And we don't put the right context on this. I don't think nobody I talk with understands this, how much debt is out there.
I think that's right, but I think there's a footnote here that we have to keep in mind, which is we don't need to pay off the debt. We look at that $30 trillion and we say, how are we going to pay $30 trillion back? You don't need to pay it off. Like a credit card, you could just roll it over so long as you can make the minimum monthly payment. Now, in the federal government's case, the minimum monthly payment, that's the interest on the debt. And as your caller points out quite correctly, as interest rates start to rise, we get into this very strange space where all of a sudden the interest on the debt that the federal government has got to pay every year, this starts to get very high. In fact, with $30 trillion in debt, a 1 percentage point increase in interest rates, just one, costs the federal government an additional $300 billion a year. So now we've got this weird situation where the Federal Reserve is stuck between a rock and a hard place. On the one hand, it needs to raise interest rates to fight inflation, but if it raises interest rates, the interest on the debt now goes up, the federal government has to pay more, and we have in effect painted the Federal Reserve into a corner where it has to choose between doing what's good for the voters, that is low inflation, and doing what's good for the federal government, that's low interest payments.
And I just want to show everybody real quick, this is usdebtclock.org. And if you look on your screen, you'll see here is the national debt, so over 31 trillion. And here is what Bob was talking about, which was the debt per citizen and debt per taxpayer. So debt per taxpayer is coming close to $250,000. On this side, you can see the income. So this is revenue, federal, state, and local revenue. Let's go next to Brian. Dickinson, North Dakota, Democrats line. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I just had a quick question, and I don't know if it's a dumb question. I know they say there is no dumb questions, but I'm curious how it works when we send, you say there's $50 billion we send to Ukraine, and then all the other wars that we've been sending money to all these different countries. Are they ever responsible to pay that money back? And if so, have they? And how does that affect our debt and how we owe other countries money? If you could maybe explain that to me. Thank you.
Yeah, one of the things to keep in mind here is that $50 billion sounds like a lot, but the federal government blows through $50 billion over the course of a matter of hours on a regular basis. So in the great scheme of federal spending, it's just change, not even change, it's fractions of pennies. But nonetheless, it's $50 billion. And your question is, so what happens here? One of the things we have to keep in mind is that often, not always, but often, investing, for example, in Ukraine, we're going to send them $50 billion to help them, comes back later to us dressed up not as repayments of the loan, but as a stable country, as an ally even. And that can be worth more to us in terms of actual dollars down the road than paying back the $50 billion.
And we have a question to you from Debbie in New Mexico via text. Could you ask your guest to explain the Powell memo? Because that seems to be what they are pushing. Do you know what the Powell memo is?
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with the Powell memo.
Okay, let's go to Michael next, who's in Plainfield, Illinois, Independent line.
Yeah, I'm going to be somewhat critical of your guests. I don't know what school of economics they came from, but all of life is redistributed, okay? You know, the clouds rain on the land, and then crops are grown, and people harvest that, and we plow it back into the system, and we go around and around. So high taxes are absolutely needed and necessary to a functioning, viable economy. And this is the problem of the U.S. And you haven't mentioned anything about this. You're always, Americans want this stuff for free. Look at the rich steal all their money. They bought off the politicians, and the entire defense network is just sitting there protecting their assets. So what we need is massive increases on taxes for the rich, and then we'll have a vibrant economy. In the 80s, when I was still working, just starting out, I had a good job. I was making $48,000 a year, which was the equivalent of about $200 or $250 now. And we had 70% taxes on the bank I worked for. And you know what? They gave big raises because they didn't want to give the money to the federal government. So you keep talking about cut. I say, no, let's tax. And then if we can't pay for this, then we cut.
All right, Michael, let's get an answer.
Well, I think one of the important things we have to keep in mind, and this is a place where, again, I think we can bring the people on the right and the left together, is to recognize that we are a society, and we have in front of us two tools. One is government, and the other is markets. And the key to becoming a vibrant society is knowing when to use the right tool for the right problem. And what we have had a tendency to do is to invoke government as the tool every time. And so we see a problem, we run to Washington, and we say, you've got to do something about this. And there are certain problems in which government is absolutely the right tool, and you absolutely need taxes to apply government to whatever this problem is that you want to deal with. But it's not always the right tool. And when we start to apply government in places where it shouldn't be applied, yes, we raise taxes to have the government do whatever it's doing. But when we raise those taxes, what we're necessarily doing is squelching markets. So we can have more of this thing. Let's talk about higher education at the moment. If we're going to tax people and pay for higher education, we'll get more higher education. Absolutely we will. But we're necessarily going to get less of other things. We're going to get less computers, less houses, less food, things like this. And so the question in front of us is that a decent trade-off? But we tend not to think in terms of the trade-off. We tend to think only in terms of, I want more of this thing, rather than asking, well, what do I have to give up to get that thing?
All right, David in LaGrange, Illinois, Independent Line. Can you be brief, David?
Yes. I'm just wondering, we gave out $1 trillion that I'm assuming we shouldn't have done. You're thinking we shouldn't have done because it was inflationary. But did we not first give $5 trillion to the banks to make sure that the system, I hear you and everybody talk about the $1 trillion, but I never hear anybody talk about the $5 trillion that went to the bank first, because we had to, keep the prime the pump. When
right.
do we've never stopped priming the pump since 2008, right? We said, hey, we're going to lower rates, but we never brought them up, right? We had low rates for a long time, which creates a bubble. You knew this. They knew this. Everybody knew this. But if we're making money and next year we're going to make another 5 or 10%, let's do it for 10 or 12 years, build the bubble up, right? Correct?
All right, David.
Yeah, and I have to underline what something you said there, David. I'm against the government handing out money. It doesn't matter who the recipient is. I'm equally concerned about it handing out money to corporations and banks. When we're dealing with COVID, I think we were faced with having to pick the lesser of the evils. The government came in and, for all various reasons, shut down a third of the economy. What are we going to do now? The right answer would have been not to shut down the economy. Now, there's all kinds of things that happen regarding COVID on the other side, and we were uncertain, would that cause many deaths? And so, given our prudent understanding at the time, we said we need to shut down the economy. Okay, so what comes next? Well, what comes next is we've got to keep people have to eat. People have to, keep working to the extent that they can. What we decided to do was to print a bunch of money and hand it out. I don't think it was a good thing to do, but I do think it may have been the best thing we could have done under the situation. Now, what we could have done to prevent that situation from coming about in the first place goes beyond my expertise. But I think one of the things we have to be careful of is distinguishing between government acting in actual emergency and government simply acting because we want something. COVID was an emergency, a lot like World War II was. No one's going to argue that we shouldn't have been spending, deficit spending to fund World War II. So too with COVID. But there are lots of other times when we point to something and we say, we really want this thing, but it really isn't an emergency. And that's not a time for government to be printing money.
All right, Anthony Davies, co-host of the podcast Words and Numbers. Thanks so much for being on the program.
My pleasure. Thank you.